Welcome to the 15th annual Sargent Lecture, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alice Lichtenstein. People who know me know that there's nothing I enjoy more than reading a good CV, and this is a good read. So I'll just give you the high points and not eat up too much of the time. Dr. Lichtenstein knew early on that she wanted to specialize in nutrition. She got her undergraduate degree in nutrition from Cornell, Ithaca, went on to get a master's from Penn State in nutrition, and then went on to Harvard University to get a master's and a doctorate in nutritional biochemistry. And very interestingly, relatively recently, 2005, she was awarded an honorary PhD from the University of Kuopio in Finland. I'm sure there's a story there. And I'm also very pleased that she has been on the faculty at Boston University in what she calls the Cardiovascular Institute. I suspect now is the Whitehead Institute. And also in the Department of Biochemistry and Medicine. But then she got stolen away to Tufts and rose through the ranks, and now she holds multiple positions. Her two primary positions are professor, a named professor, Stanley N. Gershoff, Professor of Nutrition and Science Policy in the Friedman School. And she is also director and senior scientist, which I recognize as a research institute title, at the Cardiovascular Nutrition Laboratory in the Jean Meyer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts. So she has a number of awards. Two, probably especially to this audience, are worth singling out. She was given the American Heart Association Mentor of Women Award in 2008, and she has been named one of 10 women who shaped the world by Shape magazine. But really impressive are her service activities, both to her professional societies and federal agencies. She's done a ton of service for the American Heart Association and also the Nutrition Society. Notably, she served on the Strategic Planning Task Force for the AHA. And as is typical, she takes a leadership role in shaping these societies, which is really impressive. She's done a lot of service for the Institute of Medicine, National Academies of Sciences, and has been and apparently continues to be a member, now vice chair of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee for the USDA, Department of Health and Human Services. Her peer-reviewed publications go on and on. They're not numbered, but I note that they go on for 14 pages in small font. So really impressive, and we're very lucky to have her here today. The title she's given us is Intersection of Nutrition Science and Policy, Current Challenges. Dr. Lichtenstein.
Well, thank you for that sort of going through my career. It was an interesting perspective. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I don't know how many of you have heard other Sargent lectures, but obviously as soon as I heard that I was getting this, or having the opportunity to give this talk, which I'm sort of very excited about, the first thing I did was, well, I tried to find out as much as I could about Dr. Dudley Allen Sargent. So for those of you that have been to other lectures, you may have heard this also. But what I decided to do was sort of pick out those aspects of his career that I thought were most sort of resonated most with me. So as many of you may know, he was the director of the Sargent School for Physical Education, which initially only admitted women. It was after it had been established that I just found out that it became part of Boston University. However, one of the things I found that was most interesting is he actually challenged Victorian traditional women's fashion. And he noted that it caused women to faint, most likely because of the corsets. And he was a very strong advocate of freedom of movement of women and actually getting them out of that more traditional dress. So I figured he was my kind of person. So anyway, what I'd like to do this afternoon in addressing this issue of the intersection of nutrition science and policy is to address three questions. The first, do we know the science? Do we know enough about nutrition science? Second, can we translate the nutrition science into policy? And then third, if we can translate it into policy, can we implement change based on that policy? Because ultimately that's what we want to do. It's nice to know knowledge for knowledge's sake, but ultimately we really want to have an impact on public health, the health of the nation. So first, do we know the science? Well, fortunately, we virtually eradicated deficiency states in the United States. It's not that there isn't undernutrition and malnutrition in the United States, but it doesn't tend to be attributable to just not knowing what the essential components of a healthy diet are. And how did we do this? Well, first we identified the essential nutrients, and that happened pretty much at the turn of the 20th century. On the basis of that, food fortification programs were instituted. So we add iodine to salt, and that addressed issues related to the goiter belt in the United States. We added vitamin D to milk. That addressed issues particularly related to young children growing up in inner cities and working in factories and not getting adequate exposure to sunlight. And then we added thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron to grain products, which addressed issues related to things like pellagra, again in the South, and more recently folate, which has brought down the risk of neural tube defects in the United States. We do have feeding and food assistance programs. I don't know how many of you listened to NPR this morning, but certainly they're coming under assault for political reasons. But at any rate, we do have a number of feeding and food assistance programs which do have a relatively far reach. So we know the science, we're using the science for the public good. And then lastly, we're fortunate that we have the increased availability of food. So we in the Northeast, when March, April comes, aren't dependent on our root cellars where we really have limited options that we can get almost any food at any time. But this variety of foods ensures that we will have adequate nutrient intake. But we don't always get it right, and I think it's very important to remain cognizant of that we think we've got most of the nutrition science nailed down, but there have been some situations where we probably, in hindsight, would have done things differently. So the butter margarine controversy. At one point, the observations were made that butter was high in saturated fat and it was associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Well, if you can make a butter substitute that's high in vegetable oil, be lower in saturated fat and would have a health benefit. It wasn't until the 1990s that we then learned that, well, margarine, because of the process that's used to make a vegetable oil, convert it to a solid form, resulted in the synthesis of trans fatty acids, that, well, maybe that wasn't the best option. So now we have margarines and shortenings that are actually trans-free, low in saturated fat, but it took us a while to learn. Another area where we sort of stumbled a little bit had to do with the vitamin E, folate, beta-carotene, and heart disease, that, well, all you need to do is pop a pill and then problem solved. There was strong observational data to support that. However, when we did the intervention studies, we found that no, actually it probably wasn't the specific nutrient supplements alone, because the results were null, and it probably was that individuals who choose to regularly take nutrient supplements had other lifestyle behaviors that were associated with better health outcomes. And then lastly, the high-fat, low-fat diet craze that we went through, where the reasoning was if we consumed low-fat diets, we would decrease the energy density of the diet, the number of calories per gram, and the saturated fat, but we had an unanticipated consequence, and that was that there was a proliferation of foods that were very high in sugar, the snack wells, the non-fat brownies, non-fat ice cream, all those things, and we ended up not reaping the benefits that we'd hoped. So things are not perfect as far as nutrition science, but we've come a long way, and I think we're on very solid ground. So the next question is, can we translate nutrition science into policy? And the answer there is yes, and we've actually done it. Now, why are we particularly concerned about that? Because we do have challenges currently in the United States in terms of nutrition and health. One is that we have a high rate of chronic diseases. Those would be things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. And then we also have this emerging issue of nutrient overconsumption. And this is an area that we do not know all that much about. However, it is becoming more and more of concern because we used to rely on food in order to get our nutrients. Then nutrient supplements came on the market, and it was food and nutrient supplements. Now we have a large number of foods that sort of straddle both. So things like energy bars, cereals that have almost a vitamin pill in them, things like vitamin waters. Without working too hard at it, we can end up consuming very high levels of certain nutrients, and that's now becoming an issue. There's concern about overconsumption of folate, potentially, overconsumption of vitamin E. So these are emerging issues, and we have to think about them in addition to just the more traditional issues that we have addressed previously. So how do we translate nutrition science into policy? One is the dietary reference intakes. Those are the RDAs, the AIs, or the upper tolerable levels, the ULs. Now, these were revamped in the 1990s, and they were revamped with the recognition that we didn't need to concentrate so much on deficiency disease, but we really needed to concentrate on chronic disease, and that we also had to start thinking about upper tolerable limits. We have nutrient facts panel. Those are on all the packaged foods that we buy. Some would suggest that maybe a redesign is probably warranted because it's not necessarily the most user-friendly, and the FDA has certainly been working on that for a while. But we do have that information available. That's part of policy. We have nutrient health claims and qualified nutrient health claims. Again, that's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And it's a way of ensuring that the information that's provided to the consumer has some scientific justification and background. We have the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. These are issued by the USDA and Health and Human Services jointly. There's a federal mandate that every 5 years the dietary guidelines in the United States be updated. So those activities are currently going on. They're subject to open meeting rules, so any meeting is broadcast live on the web and is then archived and made available, and anyone can attend those meetings and anyone can submit public comment. And then the USDA has translated the dietary guidelines to icons that are linked to actually computer programs that are meant specifically for the public so they can start tracking how they're doing. Not that everyone uses these types of information, however, they are available. So what I'd like to spend most of our time on is the third question, and that is, can we implement change based on public policy in the desired direction? And we've seen that in some cases things do go awry, so it's not an unreasonable question to ask. And when thinking about that, I think there are two things to think about. And one is societal, environmental factors that impede positive change, and those are the challenges, and we can learn from those. And then the other is the societal, environmental factors that promote positive change. And we have some very good examples of those, and we can learn from those to see whether some of the elements can be applied to other areas. So first, the challenges. The number of calories that's available per capita in the United States has gone up until about 2005, and now it's sort of hovering around here. That means that there's more energy per person, and that's being reflected in body weights. Now, we certainly don't want to promote food shortages, but this is a challenge because food is readily available. But I think what's more important to think about is exactly what type of food that we're consuming and what the trends are. And what happened with this expanding food supply is in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we had the low-fat craze. And what happened is this is grain products. The consumption of grain products increased, and then eventually it plateaued. But it plateaued higher than it started. We then got into the low-carb craze. And what you can see is now the intake of fats and oils has increased, and then it also plateaued at the high level. So what's happened is a total number of calories has actually increased. Now, on the other hand, for as long as dietary guidance has been provided, we have been recommending that people consume more fruits and vegetables. Well, here's the vegetable line, and here's the fruit line. And somehow, regardless of the efforts that have been put into it, certainly creative in terms of things like the 5-a-day program, regardless of availability, which has increased dramatically in the United States, so you can get strawberries almost any time of the year, and we have very high quality frozen fruits and vegetables. We haven't seemed to be making too much of a budge in that, but this is something that certainly I think is challenging. What would have been nice is if as there was a leveling off of carbs and fats went up, that then the carbs would go down, but clearly that's not the case. Now, on the other side of that, the share of disposable income that we spend on food has dramatically decreased since the 1930s. Again, what that means is that it's more affordable for almost anyone to consume a lot of calories. Again, we don't want to make food so expensive that people go hungry, but it is a challenge in a situation where you've got more food per capita, that's per person, and you have cheaper food. And what we also need to consider is that doesn't mean that it necessarily is going to translate to a higher quality diet. So this slide is a little bit busy, but the x-axis essentially is increasing cost of the diet, and the y-axis is nutrient density. And what we can see is that as you go to the most expensive diets, they're the ones that are the richest in the essential nutrients. And when you continue to look at the most expensive diets, they're also the ones that are lower in the dietary components that we should be limiting. So the added sugars, the trans fat, and the saturated fat. So although we have a lot of food and the food is relatively cheap, the cheapest food is not necessarily the best in terms of association with chronic disease risk. So it's a double-edged sword. One of the other challenges we have in our society is that most of the foods that are most heavily advertised tend to be the ones that are high in saturated fat added sugar and sodium, salt. So that if you look at a supermarket advertisement, the kind that comes weekly, what you can see is those foods that are on sale, that are featured. You've got chips, cookies, crackers, brownie mix, chips, pudding, sugar water, and then we get into high salt, and high salt. So that also is challenging because it's a bargain, and we all like bargains. It's not that we can't create better options, and it's not that industry is set against it. It's just that industry wants to make money. And industry really doesn't care, the food industry, whether they sell foods that are, we would call sort of healthy foods, and those that are less healthy foods. They really respond to consumer demand. So if the demand is there, they're going to provide them. Now, there are other options more recently. It's been shown that, well, first of all, just the technology to be able to market peeled carrots or apple slices that have a reasonably long shelf life was a big breakthrough. And what the research shows is that putting a cartoon character on a bag of carrots makes it more likely that the child is going to eat those carrots. Well, you might as well take advantage of it. We also have things like ground turkey that are 99% fat-free. We have whole wheat hamburger buns that are the same price as regular hamburger buns now. So it's not that industry can't do it. Industry will continue providing those foods if the consumer supports them. If the consumer doesn't support those types of items and they support the other types of items that are heavily salted or heavily sugared, then that's what they're going to provide. Now, why is this important? So this is just one example. This has to do with sugar-sweetened beverages. It's the 3 Harvard cohorts. And what they did is they got dietary information and weight information. They get it every 4 years. So they looked at the change in consumption of the sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice and sugar-sweetened beverages calorically are essentially equivalent. And then they looked at change in body weight over that 4-year period. And what they found is those people who reported consuming more, increasing their consumption of the sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice, increased their body weight over that period of time. So, and obviously there are a lot more examples like this. So it is important that for us to focus from a policy perspective on these sort of what could be considered weak points. Now, it used to be if you went out and you were thirsty and you were somewhere and you hit a vending machine, the only thing that would be available would be sugar-sweetened beverages. Then it sort of shifted to sugar-sweetened beverages and diet, and eventually now we see water, but the default option had been sugar-sweetened beverages. Now, you've already seen, this has to do again with disposable income, the first curve here. And that has to do with the amount of money that we spend, the percent of our income that we spend on food. And this line here, which goes down a little more precipitously, is the amount of money that we spend on food on home. But what's more important is the amount of money that we spend on food away from home. And it used to be about 2.5%, and it's risen modestly to about 4.5%. But the important thing is that the difference here is not all that great, that we're getting to the point where we're spending almost as much on food that we consume away from home as we consume on food that we consume at home. Now, why does that matter? Well, the reason that matters is we don't have as much control over what we consume in the food that's prepared away from home, both in terms of quantity and in terms of what goes into the food. These are some data that Lori and Urban, Sue Roberts, and I did, where what we were looking at is ethnic foods in chains that, or non-chains, that had no calorie labeling. And we were trying to find out in all these different ethnic restaurants that are listed on the x-axis exactly how many calories are in the food if you ordered dinner portions. So we sent students out to local restaurants that they could commute with public transportation to. And they purchased the food, and then we brought it back to the lab. We homogenized it. We used a bomb calorimeter, and we actually determined the energy content of the food. And the line that you see here is about a third of what most of us need to consume in any one day. What you see here, and these were different samples, is what the caloric content was of these various meals. Now, the mean was 1,260 calories. Obviously, there's a lot of variability, but it's obviously extremely high. And this is one of the reasons why there is a lot of concern about the increased reliance on food prepared outside the home. This is another way of thinking about it, and again, this is one of many, many examples, but along the y-axis is the hazards ratio for coronary heart disease mortality, and then along the x-axis is the number of times per week the participants reported in consuming fast food. And as you can see, although there's a lot of variability, the more consumption of fast food, the higher the hazards ratio for cardiovascular disease mortality. Now, this is association, it's not causation. There are probably other characteristics that also predispose this population to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But again, it is one factor that may be contributing, and this is another example of where restaurants want to sell food. If the consumer demands healthier options, they will provide more and more healthier options. If the consumer prefers the less healthy options, those are the options that will be available. Fad diets. All right, raise your hand. How many people remember what the first law of thermodynamics is? I promise I won't ask you. Okay, first law of thermodynamics. The total inflow of energy into a system must equal the total outflow of energy, plus some change in the energy contained within the system. Okay, it means you can't create or destroy energy, right? Well, that's not what fad diets are telling us. So you got one fad diet, burn fat fast, no dieting or pills. Sounds better than probably most of us in the room would tell somebody, so why not believe it? Or the zone diet, no meal or snack that's forbidden. Now, you can say, well, this is just not so, from a logical perspective. And I think if you ask anybody, they would agree with that. However, there are a lot of diet books that are sold every year, an extraordinary number of diet books. And I suspect people who purchase those diet books probably have a whole library of those diet books. However, they haven't been particularly all that useful. So in the 1970s, we had the low-carb diets, and everybody was running around with keto sticks if you were alive at that time. They were dipsticks for urine to show that you were ketotic. Then in the 1990s, we had the low-fat craze, and we really went into that really deeply. And then, we cycled back. There are not that many options. Then we cycled back in the early 2000s to the low-carb diets. We're sort of hovering around now with gluten and low gluten diets, but there are a number of perturbations, so we're going to have to keep going back and forth. However, what the unfortunate result is, or the unfortunate association, is that we've just become fatter and fatter and fatter. So fad diets actually are not helping us. This was the data for 1985, which is the first that the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, list on their website. And this is an indication of the percent of individuals in each state that are obese. And it's interesting that the white is no data, that it wasn't even tracked in a lot of states. However, you can see in just 15 years how the map has darkened. and we see a high percent of the states actually approaching 24%, 20 to 24%, and then in 2010, you can see we've actually progressed to the point where there are a number of states that have greater than 30%. So this is not just something that we're talking about that the nutrition community is yelling wolf about. This is really happening. And now what the CDC had to do is they actually had to recalibrate the colors for describing obesity in the United States. So this is the old rubric, and you can see with the new one that there's now a category for greater than 35% of the population being obese. And then that's not saying anything but about the percent of the population in each of those states that is overweight. So this is a real problem. We've been through a lot of fad diets. We have a lot of diet books out there, and we have a lot of talk about it, but it's something that from a public health perspective still remains a challenge, which means we have to think about things differently. I think we also need to be very concerned about what I call the knee-jerk reaction. One knee-jerk reaction is blame industry. It's industry that's causing the problem. They're filling us with crummy food, therefore they're to blame. Well, the other thing that we've been talking about is portion size. You go out and the portions are so big. And to a certain extent, that's true. So here's data from 1998 to 2000, and what you can see, this is for drinks, that the only real difference here is the super size was added to one of the two chains. However, if you look at 2006, because of a lot of publicity about with a film, that the super size was dropped for the McDonald's, but for Wendy's, look what happened. The small got bigger, the medium got bigger, and the biggie got renamed large. And we see the same thing even more dramatically for French fries. So in 1989, the large got reclassified as medium, the supersize got reclassified as large, and a new large supersize was added. In Wendy's, the small became a kid's meal, which meant you felt really silly if you're an adult ordering it. The medium grew in size. The biggie stayed the same, and the great biggie stayed the same. However, by the time 2006 came along, for the chain that was the focus of the movie, lost the super size and things shrunk a bit. But look what happened in the second chain, that the medium now got reclassified as a small, the biggie as a medium, and probably because it was too embarrassing to order a great biggie, the great biggie got reclassified as a large. So knee-jerk, it's just because we're being served too big portions. Well, what's happened since then? And this again is work that was done with Lorian Urban and Sue Roberts at Tufts. And I'll walk you through this slide since there's a lot of information. Each bar is divided into 3 segments. So the percent of calories contributed by a cheeseburger, fries, and cola. If you just went and ordered small size, but for 3 different chains. So the green chain, the pink chain, and the blue chain. And what we were interested in was there still this drift over time? And what we found, first the green chain, is that really there wasn't that much change over the 14-year period. For the pink chain, you were getting more calories, but although there was variation, ended up where it sort of started. And the same thing pretty much for the blue chain. The blue chain a little bit higher, but that actually started in 2008. However, what we did find is that it provided a little over 700 calories, where for an adult is about a third of what they would need in any one day, whereas for a child, it's considerably greater. But what was even more surprising was the large sizes. If you went in and you ordered a large cheeseburger, I guess it must be a double cheeseburger, it's not the kind of thing I normally order, fries and cola, again, for the green chain, wasn't all that much of a change. For the pink chain, actually there was a decrease over the 14-year period. But for the blue chain, there was actually an increase. But the most striking thing is that the average number of calories actually represented between 2/3 and 3/4 of what a normal adult needs. So just going in for one of those bundled meals, which is frequently favorably priced, resulted in extraordinarily high intakes. But the knee-jerk reaction, we're being served, it's just that portion sizes are increasing, is not probably really the answer. The portion sizes have been very large for a long time. So we have to think a little bit differently about that. So lastly, what I'd like to do is talk about some societal, environmental factors that actually have promoted positive change, so that have been successes. And I think that it's important to learn from these. So everybody probably recognizes this gentleman. Well, I do spend usually once a year some time in Finland, and once it was introduced, a radical group actually captured Ronald McDonald, and you see what happened. I'm not necessarily advocating this. I don't think it really solves the problem, but you can see that, different people have different, take different, ways of dealing with things. However, there are some positive things that we do know about. The first has to do with changing food choices, and this was a study, and it was a relatively simple study. And you probably could guess what the results were. If we had clickers, you could all guess. But this was a program to change healthier lunch choices in the cafeteria. So there were 3 experimental groups, not an uncommon design. Group 1, there was a discussion decision, so it was interactive. Group 2, lecture, it was passive audience. And then group 3 was the control group. And as probably you could guess, the group 1 did the best. 49% of the people actually made healthier choices after they went through the program. Group 2, 31%, the lecture only, made healthier choices. And group 3, even probably knowing something was afoot, they made a few healthier choices. The striking thing about this study is it was published in 1948. And quite amazingly, it was done in Newton, Massachusetts. But we've known that different education styles have different effects. Probably as a community, what we have not done is try to harness them enough, or is to really make permanent changes. And this is one reason why a colleague of mine, David Ludwig, and I wrote a commentary in JAMA titled Bring Back Home Economics Education. Now, the first thing we found out is it's not called home economics anymore. It's called family and consumer science. And we got a lot of email about that. But the point was, and we tried to raise this to the medical communities, the sort of the level of the medical community, that it was really important that we have to somehow instill some type of basic food preparation and food acquisition skills in children, because they weren't necessarily getting it home, that the role models that many of us benefited from were no longer present. And if you don't have basic food preparation and acquisition skills, and you don't feel comfortable going into a supermarket, picking up a few things, and preparing them, then you are going to be dependent on fast food restaurants, and then you are going to get into the cycle of overcaloric consumption. So we certainly were not suggesting we bring back the old traditional home economics, single gender, and that we don't feel that people need to learn how to make white sauces anymore and necessarily bake bread. However, there are certain food preparation skills they should have. And we feel that this will go beyond, the benefits will go beyond just having a child learn how to prepare a meal, that it will certainly lessen the dependence of food prepared outside the home. And that's obviously very important. But it also is going to influence the next generation's eating behaviors, because these children do grow up and they do have families of their own. And if we can educate them with good behaviors, food preparation and eating behaviors, then hopefully they will serve as role models for their children. But it's also important because we hope then, if this was instituted, to create purchasing habits that would actually encourage markets and restaurants to offer healthier options. As I've been saying, industry just wants to sell food. Restaurants just want to sell food. If we create a generation that's going to demand healthier options, and when they're available, buy them, then there are going to be more that are available. And lastly, we need to educate children as to how to use this information, this policy information that's available, how to use a nutrient facts panel. That it's not just, if you look at the number of calories, you have to know it's not the calories for the whole package, it's the calories for one serving. And you have to look at what the serving size is, since the serving size traditionally is not what we consume. Frequently it's much smaller. So now we're going to talk about 3 environmental changes that have worked. And that has to do with partially hydrogenated fat, calorie labeling, and sugar-sweetened beverages. And they all have very different courses. So the first is partially hydrogenated fat. Partially hydrogenated fat is the major source of trans fatty acids in the U.S. diet. In July 1st of 2006, the FDA ruled that there'd be mandatory labeling of trans fat on the nutrient facts panel. And it also ruled that if it was, the trans fat content was less than half a gram, that it could be labeled as 0. So this is what the nutrient facts panel looks like, and this is what that little line looks like. There was a tremendous reformulation of food products, not because of that little line, not because consumers were actually looking at this line for trans fat, but because prior to that, you just had to list saturated fat. So if you wanted the certain characteristics of a fat, it was advantageous to use a very hydrogenated fat that was very high in trans, because you didn't have to list it, and then you could put in a fat that was lower in saturated fat. So initially, industry said we can't do it. People aren't going to like the cookies. We're going to have to reformulate all our brand cookies and crackers and everything, and voila, it happened, and it had a very profound effect on our food supply. One of the other things that happened a bit later is New York City, as you know, banned the use of partially hydrogenated fat. And they did it in a very smart way. They created this help center. They provided information on where restaurateurs could get fats that were low in trans fat, that weren't partially hydrogenated. They monitored the marketers to make sure they didn't price gouge. They actually provided cooking advice for restaurants on what proper substitutions were. And it actually looks like it worked. So the dotted line is the trans fat content of purchases that were made in a number of chain restaurants in New York City in 2007, before the ruling went into effect. The solid line is the content of trans fat in the transactions after 2009. And you can see that this whole group here, between about 4 and 8 grams of trans fat, which is a tremendous amount of trans fat, has essentially been eliminated. It doesn't mean that you can't still get some foods that have a fair amount of trans fat, but it's considerably lower. This is an example of how public policy worked. It was an environmental change. So I call it the default option. You have to go out of your way to get food that's high in trans fat in New York City. It's not that you can't get it, but you have to go out of your way. And then just last month, the FDA announced, so this would be federal policy, that it was taking partially hydrogenated fat off the GRAS list. The GRAS list is generally recognized as safe. These are food additives that are considered to not pose a risk to health on the basis of whatever the data is. And the FDA has determined that the level of data has risen to the point where they're going to be taken off the GRAS list. And this gives you an idea of what foods still are high in trans fat. So again, it's the default option. You're going to have to go out of your way to find foods that are high in trans fat. The second of 3 examples is calorie labeling. Calorie labeling is highly controversial, and actually more controversies have been raised in terms of its effect. So again, this was New York City led the nation, and hopefully it'll eventually become federal policy, that calories must be posted on menu boards, printed menus, and associated materials. So you have to have it at the point of purchase. And also that calories must be posted on item tags for daily specials, where you see they were sort of really big, you're getting a deal. And they also must be posted for the combination of things like value meals. So you don't have to do any math. It's right there. And here are some examples. So this is an example of sandwiches. Here's your price. The calories have to be in the same font size. So you can't miss it. And here's a great one. I like this example. This came from New York City, because for 89 cents, you can get anywhere from 170 calories to 460 calories. That's pretty amazing. But the point is now, though that information is available. So if one is so motivated, they can make decisions right at the point where they're ordering as to whether they're going to use it or not. So what have we found out about that? Well, there's a lot of data here, and I'm just going to highlight 2 lines. So one of them is that, lo and behold, before the calorie labeling and after the calorie labeling, it looks like the mean calorie intake went up about 25 calories. So needless to say, this was very disappointing to the sponsors of the program. But it turns out there was a confounding factor, and it had to do with Subway. Subway had introduced their $5 foot-long sub. And that drove sales tremendously from the 6-ounce to the 12-ounce. So another way of looking at that is people who said that they didn't use the information, or people who said they did use the information. And there was about 100 fewer calories that were ordered each time. Now, 100 fewer calories every day means 10 pounds a year. Every other day is 5 pounds a year. This can have a significant effect, and it was even consistent for Subway once calorie labeling was posted. Okay, the last example has to do with sugar-sweetened beverages. That has been a little more tricky. As you know, there's no ban on supersized soda. There have been so that was blocked by the courts. But there has been efforts to educate people, and there are 2 examples that I think are useful to see. The first has to do with just graphically depicting how much sugar is actually in different sizes of soda. Because even telling people there are 3 tablespoons, 4 tablespoons, whatever, is not as useful as showing sugar cubes. But hopefully this will work, and it's a very short video. But this is from New York City. It's available to anyone. Okay, so you get an idea. So you can have some very, I think there's some very creative things that can be done, and it's yet to be seen how effective they are. But if you just look at the percent of the supermarket aisles that have regular soda versus diet and water, there's been a real shift. If you look at all the vending machines, there's been a real shift. In a lot of places, whether it be schools or YMCA's or workplaces, they're actually not providing on-site sugar-sweetened beverages, and we'll see what happens. I bring this up because Mexico has now taken this on. Mexico has a major problem with obesity, and they have actually legislated a higher tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, and this is also something New York City tried to institute but was blocked in the courts, and again, yet to be seen. But there was an interesting commentary in the New York Times about this, saying, well, a lot of this is cultural, and you have to understand that it's hard to get clean water, and certainly historically hard to get clean water in Mexico, and that's why people were consuming bottled drinks, and they happen to be sugar-sweetened beverages. So every different area has a slight difference. But anyway, in summary, the intersection of nutrition science and policy. Do we know the science? Yes, we know a lot of the science. Do we always get it right? Not always. However, we get it right most of the time. Can we translate nutrition science into public policy? Sure, we do it all the time. The challenge really is how to get people to actually embrace the policy that is provided, and can we implement changes based on public policy? I think we are now beginning to learn how to do it, and I think we need to put more emphasis now on figuring out how to change behavior than on the little details about whether a little more of this is better. So with that, this is the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I thank you for your attention. Yeah. Questions?
So one of the major takeaway lessons is that I got from this is that consumer behavior is really driving the food industry to provide the products that they do. But do you feel that the food industry deserves any share of the blame, or is it solely just consumer behavior?
Well, the food industry certainly puts a tremendous amount of time, effort, and money into figuring out how to get the consumer to buy their products. And they don't spend as much probably on developing products, sort of modifying the products that are particularly popular to make them healthier. So from that perspective, I think industry could do more. And I think what would probably be the best would be for industry and the nutrition community to work together in a concerted effort moving forward. So obviously, they play a major role, but if suddenly people stopped buying crackers, heavily salted crackers or heavily salted chips, they could switch. They could change on a dime to lower salt ones.
Well, thank you for a really engaging talk. My question also was related to this dichotomy you sort of set up between consumer and food manufacturer producer. But I was interested in your point about education. And I'm wondering if there aren't larger systemic issues here, particularly to do with healthcare, and whether you see those changing, in particular with more preventative healthcare, now that the American public is shouldering or going to shoulder more of the costs of some of the issues coming out of these nutritional problems that we're seeing en masse now. So I was wondering if you could speak to that point.
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point. It has to be sort of a multifactorial approach, and that means that physicians need to be more proactive with their patients, whether it be with children, whether it be with adults, as far as indicating that there is a weight problem, let's say for weight. We don't seem to have a problem telling people that their cholesterol is too high. Yet there seems to be a problem, and there's been research studies on this, about bringing up the subject of body weight with patients. There is a role there because that would be one factor as far as prevention goes. I think other factors would have to do with putting more emphasis on dietary counseling, providing reimbursement for registered dietitians, but starting earlier, not waiting until there's a problem, but sort of trying to nip it in the bud. And I think that's where we're really falling down, and hopefully we'll do better on. Did that get at your point?
Yeah.
Hello. My question is, why those fad diets that you previously mentioned, why do you think that they weren't as effective and the obesity rates actually increased?
Okay, so the question is, why have fad diets, why do they tend not to be effective? Well, in the short term, they do tend to be effective. It's just not in the long term. And personally, I think it's because our eating habits are formed For a lot of different reasons. One has to do with our personal preferences, one has to do with our upbringing, one has to do with availability. And what happens is when you go on a diet, you make a radical change. And infrequently, it's cutting out a whole category of foods, so automatically you eat less. However, what we saw with the low-fat diet craze is that then there was a proliferation of foods that were low in fat but were really high in refined sugars and really weren't all that different calorically, but somehow because they were low fat became low calorie, we ate more of them and we got fatter. Also, people then, because the fad diet wasn't consistent with their normal patterns, ultimately they sort of fell off the wagon and went back to their old eating habits, which caused the problem to begin with. Then we had the low-carb diet, and suddenly there was a proliferation of foods. Low-carb pasta, low-carb bagels, low-carb brownies. It was pretty amazing. And so initially people had cut out a large segment of foods, and then suddenly all those foods they normally would not be eating if they were trying to watch their weight, they suddenly started eating. And again, they didn't change the basic behaviors that caused the problem to begin with. So I think that's why fad diets don't work. I think what you have to do is sort of step back and say, okay, well, where are the situations where I'm overeating? Is it that I'm preparing lunches for my family and I'm licking the peanut butter, off the knife or something, and those are 50 extra calories a day, and that can add up. Or in my workplace, it happens to be that around the coffee pot, somebody always puts out food, and regardless of whether I'm hungry or not, I snack. So, and I think if one could step back and look at where the weak points are, and they're going to be different for each individual, then it's more likely that small systemic changes can be made, as opposed to what's happening with just jumping from one fad diet to another fad diet.
So I've heard the claim thrown around that a high, intense level of education in nutrition doesn't make so much of a significant difference in someone's health compared to if they just had a basic knowledge, something like the level of my plates, or however those who were educated in the 1948 study, whatever they got. I guess what I want to ask you is, at what point do you think that an education in nutritional science just kind of bogs down the public's view and is almost destructive to their diet?
You mean can you give me an example?
Or at a point to which it doesn't help.
You mean too much information?
Yes, too much
okay,
information.
Too much information. Well, certainly too much information can be detrimental, especially if it's not interpreted in the way it should be interpreted. And I think a good example of that would be something like health claims. So we have health claims that walnuts are good for us, almonds are good for us, that certain vegetable oils are good for us, soy protein is good for us. And the message is, well, these foods are good for us. So, for the nuts, since we've heard a lot about nuts recently, once that Mediterranean diet study came out, the messages were, well, throw a handful of nuts in your cereal in the morning, and a handful of nuts in your yogurt for lunch, and in your salad for dinner. No one said anything about taking food out. And if you're not going to increase caloric intake, you got to take something else out. And we don't quite get that message there. So it's sort of almost maybe too much information. And then we do get a lot of information about, okay, fiber is good for us. We're not consuming enough fiber. Well, and wow, these bars have 7 grams of fiber. Terrific. I'm going to consume an extra bar every day. Again, so I think maybe that's what's happening. It's that we're getting, it's not too much information, but it's the information is presented in a way that is interpreted in a way that may be causing some problems.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
First, I want to say thank you. First, I want to say thank you for such a delightful talk, and I applaud your work in translating nutrition science into policy. I'm Ki Chan, I'm a faculty here, and I would like to ask, based on your expertise, that the fact that there is an increasing implementation or consumption of genetic modified food, what is your take and your future vision and where you stand in GMO labeling, which has been in the news quite recently, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, this is personal thoughts because I'm not an expert in GMO labeling. But I think that, from what I understand and from the basic science, I'm not concerned about consuming GMO foods. I think there are some advantages because you can use less pesticides and herbicides. It can provide more food from a smaller plot of land, something like that. I think labeling could have unfortunate consequences because if you see a can, let's say of Coca-Cola or cola, that doesn't have any GMO sugarcane in it, and you see a can of some water that they can't put the GMO label on because the spring is near one of the plots of land that has GMO food, then that would be unfortunate. Or if you just had 2 cans of cola, one that had a GMO label and one didn't, if the interpretation is, well, then the one without the GMO label is good for me, it's still got all the refined sugar in it. So I think we have to think really carefully about it, and I think what we really have to do is think very carefully about how we present nutrition messages, which goes back to the other comment, and provide it in a way that when it's interpreted by your average consumer, not people sitting in this room necessarily, that we get the right message across.
What I'm going to suggest at this point is that those with further questions move up to the second floor where we should have some healthy food and drink waiting for us. And thank you very much for a very thoughtful visit.